first of all, thank you for doing this and the hospitality. It's wonderful here.
Well, we're delighted that you are here, and we're glad you found the place. It's a place that means a lot to me.
I certainly know that. Let's start earlier in your life. You were born in Germany. Tell me about your early days, your childhood, and before you came to the U.S.
I was born in 1916 in Munich. My father was in the army, and in France. My mother lived in Munich, and when he came back from the war in 1919, I first met him. And I still remember somehow or other my first meeting with my father then. And by the time I was 6, I was taken to school, grammar school, for 4 years. And then my parents made the decision that I should go into the gymnasium, as it was called, which was the that type of high school that specialized in antiquity. So I had 9 years of Latin and 6 years of Greek and 9 years of history and 7 years of geography, etc., etc., etc. And then I was graduated from high school in late April of 1935. By that time, of course, Hitler had already been in power. He came to power January 30th, 1933. And matters had already begun to be difficult, at least in some ways. My late father, because he was a decorated veteran of the First World War, he had been a sergeant in the army, was allowed to continue to teach. He was a mathematician and physicist. And when I was finished with high school, I had a dream all along to becoming a rabbi. So on May 1st, I went to Berlin, where I had never been before, to enroll in the seminary. And after about 6 weeks there, an opportunity to get a scholarship, or to apply for a scholarship, of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was the American equivalent of the seminary that I was studying in Berlin, came through. They were sending 5 scholarships. By a chain of circumstances that is a little too difficult to now tell you about, I was finally picked as one of the 5. And so in late August of 1935, having said farewell to my parents and my 2 younger brothers, I was on board ship with my 4 friends on the way to America. And we landed here around Labor Day. And my American life began.
I'd like to go back for just a second.
Sure.
It had been your dream for many years to become a rabbi. And as soon as that airplane gets away from us here, you said that it had been a lifelong dream to become a rabbi. Tell me about how that idea was planted in your spirit and how you wanted to fulfill it.
Well, I think there are really 2 causes, if you will. There had always been a story that in my mother's family, my mother was born in Russia, in Ukraine. She was 6 months old when her family fled a pogrom, and she was brought as a 6 months old to Nuremberg, very well-known German city, of course, and was therefore raised her entire life, both as a toddler and as a grown-up. But it was a story that in her family there had been rabbis. She told me that. When I prepared for my bar mitzvah, which occurred, of course, when I was beginning to be 12, and then on to the 13th birthday in May of 1929, the idea that I should become a rabbi really kind of grew and confirmed itself in me. And while there were 1 or 2 crises, I should say, or possibilities of different options, I once wanted to become an explorer in dark Africa. And early on, I got really enamored of being a streetcar conductor, because that seemed a very glamorous job to me when I was 13 or whatever. Aside from those temptations, I stayed with the idea of wanting to be a rabbi for the entire rest of my upbringing, my teenage, you might call it, and then since then.
You're coming to America in 1935. May well have spared your life in view of what happened in your native country.
There's no question that most of the young men that were in the training at the seminary perished.
How did the Holocaust and all the terrible things that happened come to influence your faith, and how did your faith evolve as the cause of that, Rabbi?
This is really a key to my whole being today. First of all, my father was taken to Dachau concentration camp on November the 9th, 1938, when some of the leadership of the Jewish community was corralled and taken to concentration camps in order to speed their emigration from Germany, because at that time the intention was to clean Germany out of Jews. Fortunately, my mother had a brother living in Brazil, and it was through that circumstance that my family was able to emigrate to Brazil. But I must also say to you that increasingly my understanding the more I began to read about and understand what the Holocaust really was, and its impact particularly on my theology became more and more decisive. In fact, I underwent a crisis of faith because my understanding of God at the time was such that I had no options, really. If God permitted the Holocaust, then I couldn't pray to him. If God was not in the Holocaust, who needed God? And there were questions, and therefore also at first no real answers. I'll cut short, and I'll tell you that in the last 10, 12 years, and it's really only since then, in a manner that I can really ultimately confirm for myself, I've come to the conclusion, number one, that God is neither omnipotent nor omniscient, but that God is a sufferer, and that the suffering God is the God of Auschwitz, that he suffered with his people. I can now retrospectively put a lot of good biblical material into this construction. I can, for instance, say that when God created Adam, he immediately had to understand that he created himself a counterplayer, and that the only item in the created order that was given the prohibition, namely Adam, promptly broke that prohibition, clearly indicating that God had given up control, total control, that from now on God had to share that, which meant, of course, for me that any idea to try to depict God as omnipotent did not conform any longer, was no longer able to be harmonized with God as creator. And once I understood that, things really fell in place. And out of these considerations came, in fact, a conclusion that is both stunning to me but also extraordinarily exciting. I realized that God needs me, that the suffering God is a God who is looking for, reaching out for, in need of those of us who, so understanding God, are prepared to serve him and to bring him joy, and to really simply let God know I'm here. Here not only for other human beings, of course, that is self-understood, but also here for God. And I must say that therefore this Greek philosophic construct of the omnipotence and omniscience, which is fully understandable in the philosophic quest for the ultimate, really is neither biblical, nor does it seem to me make any allowance for what happened to the Jewish people, and to others, of course, but to the Jewish people now in the first place in my own world during those years of the Holocaust.
I have read about your life and some of your teachings that the experience there and how it is attuned to the basic tenets of Reform Judaism really are the guiding principles that are your work, that there is pluralism, that there is inclusiveness, that there is a need to reach out and bridge out to other faiths. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, it's exactly because God is not singular in the sense that the covenant means some kind of monopoly. The covenant is God's reaching out for someone who will do God's work. And there are many others who are searching for the same opportunity, and maybe even sometimes doing a better job than we do, that I do. So I'm totally committed to the notion that I neither have a monopoly on God or God on me, but that we are all together in a quest to try to figure out what our human, and in this instance my Jewish, responsibility is, how I am to answer the question that God is, the question that life is, and that life poses to me at every moment that I'm conscious and awake. So I not only cannot and would not assert that I have any kind of special relation in the sense that it would be exclusive, but that, quite on the contrary, whatever is special about the relationship is really an urgent invitation for everybody to consider themselves not only included but on a similar quest. And to those who are willing thus to understand themselves and in their relation to God are certainly my fellow travelers on the road to who knows where.
You found a kindred spirit in the late Cardinal Bernardine here in Chicago, who, looking out over the many differences and the diversity in the community of Chicago, saw the need to reach out to people of other faiths, other people of goodwill, and try to bridge their differences. Could you speak about that relationship and the metropolitan group of religious leaders who got together and started talking together and started doing things together?
Yeah. When Cardinal Bernardine first came to Chicago, he called together a group of Jewish leaders. I was among them because I held a position at the time that included me. And the first thing he said, "I'm Joseph, your brother," quoting the biblical story, of course, of Joseph, who finally discloses his true identity to his brothers who were so afraid of him and had such a guilty conscience concerning him, rightly so. And the moment he said that, somehow or other, many questions were answered without any further dialogue, really, or conversation. Because it was very clear that here came a man who, out of the depth of his own soul and convictions, felt called on to reach out, in this instance, to us. We felt an immediate empathy and had the, I will now really say that blessed moment of recognition that here was a great prince of the church who wanted to have us included in his life and in the world of which he was such an important component. That he did this then also to others is quite understandable and natural. because again, I don't want to think that we had any kind of permanently special position, though of course, considering the history of our community in relation to the church over many centuries, these kinds of experiences are extraordinary and in some ways really revolutionary. As a result of his being in Chicago and taking, what I should say, a census of the Chicago scene, came to the conclusion that what was necessary was to form a group of the leadership of the various religious segments of the community. And so he called into being what is called as the Council of Religious Leaders of Metropolitan Chicago, of which he was then the first president. When he had served his 2 years, a black minister who was representing the Church of Christ became his successor, and to my total astonishment, because I had just become part of that table, I was invited to become the next president of that organization and served my 2 years, after which the group decided that I should become the permanent representative of the Jewish community in their own conference, because it was up to that time, and still is, that the president of the Board of Rabbis is ex officio a member of that group, as is the executive vice president of the Board of Rabbis, who in this instance happened to be my son-in-law. But it has been my inclusion into this group and the work that we have been able to do with each other that is absolutely extraordinary. There isn't a question from which we would shy away. We now know each other's language. We know how we address a given problem. We know what our commitments are, and even though the table changes from time to time of necessity, still in all there is enough of a permanence to it that time and time again some of the most pressing problems of the community have been able to be addressed by us.
Cite some examples of that.
For instance, the question of the homeless, question of insufficient educational facilities for the poor, not sufficient medical facilities for ghetto dwellers, matters of police brutality, etc., etc. Any of the issues which are not necessarily restricted to Chicago, but are probably fairly universal in our larger cities, to which our attention has been called, or to which we felt the need to address ourselves. We have done so. Whether we've always been effective is a different question. But we have this remarkable sense of comradeship, which I think up to now promises to each of us that nothing could happen to any one of us or our communities without we not jointly addressing it. There were, for instance, there was an attack on some Jews in a given neighborhood in Chicago. Well, members of this table came to a protest, religious service that really indicated, without any question, that there was solidarity.
In addition to this sort of ecumenical work in Chicago, you have served on the national scene and international scene. I saw the picture in there not long ago of the Parliament of World Religions. What is that organization and what do they do?
Again, this is a Chicago phenomenon. In 1988, a group, in this instance of Buddhist monks and Hindu devotees, decided that since in 1893, there had been a Parliament of the World's Religions in Chicago in connection with the Chicago World Exposition at the time, the Columbian Exposition, that anniversary ought to be observed. And so they called together, again, a group of people, I happened to be among them, to form a directorate to think of ways of commemorating the event. The way this developed was then that we formed the Council of the Parliament of the World's Religions, and in 1993 we had our first international gathering. 7,000 to 8,000 religious characters, leaders from all over the world, including the Dalai Lama and the Vatican Cardinal that was representing the Holy Father, etc., descended on Chicago, and for a whole week we had programs and gatherings and so on. And then we decided, because it was such a great event, that we would make it permanent. And then we had, in 1999, our second such convention in a parliament in Cape Town. And now we have just chosen Barcelona for 1904, and that'll be our third such international meeting.
There's a statement of yours that I read that the faith of others is important for one's own faith. How does a group of people from so many different religious faiths and traditions coming together like that perhaps maybe teach you more about your own faith and your own humanity?
There's no question that when you hear others who are deeply convinced and committed to their own faith, that you learn something about the faith life. And I dare say there isn't anyone that, let me just speak for myself, I'm not claiming that I know everything about even my own faith life, let alone what abstractly faith life should be like. But when I'm with others and see how they address these questions, what response they give to the question that life and God poses, then I learn something. Let me just tell you that about 3 weeks ago I'd been invited to address the International Convention of the Zoroastrians, about whom I had known relatively little. But even being with them for just 3-4 hours shed a new light on the capacity to be so inclusive, to be so gentle, to be so really profoundly peaceful, that I came away with a new commitment in my own way of trying to be no less than what they showed me to be.
Got a mosquito there when I tell you that.
Okay.
That's great. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about this wonderful place that we're in today and enjoying along with several hundred young people. And I'm good. Okay, you're good? All right, you're good, we're good. This camp started in 1951, 1952.
Right.
What was the idea behind this? There had been other camps for Jewish kids in the United States before this time, and everybody had, I suppose, their own versions of things. But what set this one apart?
Well, really two things. First of all, when I was a teenager in Germany, I belonged to a youth group, and a Jewish youth group. We called it the Jewish Boy Scouts, in fact. And the fact that it was a Jewish Boy Scout was because we weren't allowed to join others, and this was even before the Hitler period, because there was, of course, anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish feelings long before the Nazis made them a governmental policy. And having been in that group had already left a deep imprint on me, simply because the camaraderie and the walks into nature and so on, campfires and the like, it just captivated my imagination. But then the real impulse to this creation of this camp came from my invitation to be for a week part of a Methodist church camp in Iowa. My wife and I were invited to be there for a whole week, and the impact of the combination of nature, comradeship, religious devotion, and study, which we found there, was so profound that when we left the camp, my wife and I immediately said, this is something we ought to try for our own young people, because nothing like that existed at that time. Certainly not in that sector of the Jewish religious community to which we belonged, but I know in other sectors as well, because I inquired. And when I then got the opportunity to become the director of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in the Chicago and Middle West, I was able to induce the leadership to give me a little bit of leeway to pursue this project. And so we came to Chicago in 1949, and by 1951 I had found this place which had been advertised for sale. It was a boys' camp at the time, and the rest is history.
Let's talk about that history. You started, I think, the first year with 39 students, and now you have how many here?
Well, this summer we will fill about 1,100 beds. Now that doesn't mean that we have 1,100 kids here at the same time, because they come for various types of programs and various lengths of programs. But 2 weeks is the minimum, and 8 weeks is the longest. And young people, depending on age and on predilection, pick, or their parents help them pick, that kind of session to which they are attracted and to which they are appropriate. So, yes, out of the original 39, we've grown into hundreds and hundreds.
There are several different things that they can do here during the summer, but in general, how would you describe the program that the kids enjoy here?
Well, I would say the specific is the fact that we have 2 worship sessions each day, one in the morning, one in the evening, for each of the camp groups, that there is a study period each day. And I would say that is what makes this type of camp different from the ordinary recreational camp, because we also offer every recreational and arts and crafts program you can think of, from horseback riding to water skiing to archery to dancing to community singing. There's something going on all the time. The program is exceedingly rich. And what also is distinctive is that aside from the ordinary camp staff, counselors and the like, experts in various fields like dancing, singing, photography, whatever it might be, horseback riding, drama, we also have a faculty which is made up of volunteers from the rabbinate, the cantorate, and educators. And over a summer like this, we have approximately 40-some such people who will devote anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, depending on their availability and their interest, who come here and spend their time with young people. And for young people to see a rabbi in short pants, or go swimming with him, or play baseball with him, is for some really for the first time the approach to a human being whom otherwise they've seen in the pulpit maybe, or as a teacher in a classroom or something of that sort. So things happen here that just can't happen in the ordinary congregational setting.
We were talking a little bit while ago about this is a few summers here can really be a life-changing experience for a lot of these young people.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. You talked about weddings, the new rabbis who come out of this, and other religious leaders.
Over the 50 years that we've been in existence, now is our 51st session this year, I dare say we've had more than 100 young people going into the rabbinate, others into the cantorate, others have chosen education as their life's work, as a result of what they've learned here and what they experienced here. In addition to this, especially as they grow older, and we have youngsters here until they are seniors in high school, lifelong bonds have developed. We've had hundreds of weddings out of here. which is just absolutely marvelous, because some of us officiate at weddings of young people that we have had here as campers. And others we have found to have taken the life of their religious affiliation so seriously that they have taken on responsibilities in congregations, members of boards, some have become presidents of their congregations and so on. So the impact of this particular place has been, well, multiplied, I don't know by what factor, but I would say enormously. And it radiates out, because even others who are not here then hear what happens here. We usually have a waiting list of youngsters who want to come, especially to certain types of programs. We, for instance, have 2 camp communities that live in tents, and they're oversubscribed usually the moment we send out the catalog for the year, simply because kids love to be in those tents. It's much more primitive. They cook down there. They have, you know, these toilets, the portable toilets and so on. Water is piped in. But they like that better than the cabins, which are much better equipped, or other facilities we have here.
Did you ever for a minute think that in 1951 anything that would have grown from 8 acres to over 200 with all the facilities and programs like this?
This has been one astonishment after another. And I must tell you that I'm on the board of governors. I guess this is sort of almost an honorary position that they have given me. And when the director, Jerry Kay, or groups of rabbis and educators who meet during the year in order to look at the program, to evaluate what happened the last year and plan the new offerings, sometimes come up with entirely new programs, I just sit there and just shake my head, because this is far in excess of anything I ever hoped for or dreamt about. I was much more, well, what should I say, limited, timid maybe. But what has happened here is just extraordinary.
No question about that. And Roger's going to, when you guys go around and walk and talk and see some things, I'd like to make sure that, you know, we see the kids interacting with you. You get as big a charge out of this as they do out of you, it looks like.
I don't know who has a bigger charge, really, frankly. It is actually true that when my wife and I drive through the gate here, I become a different person. Everything that bothers me just kind of drops off, and I feel freer and somehow inspirited, simply because this environment and this setting and everything that is connected with it now in my memory and in my anticipation works that way.
I didn't get a chance to ask you about this earlier, but as I watched you this morning going through the Shabbat service, and I hope I'm saying that correctly.
You did.
I could see the reverence and the love you had for laying out the Torah and started to read. Tell me about your love for the Torah and all that's in there.
Well, the Torah specifically are the 5 books of Moses, and liturgically Jews use a parchment scroll that is written by a scribe and is in the same ancient form that was used thousands of years ago, which means it has no punctuation, no vowels, and it's something you have to learn how to read. But it is also the key document. It is the original sacred text out of which Jews and Judaism has drawn its insights, its rules, its hopes, its aspirations. And so Torah really, in a sense, is symbolic and represents the heart of the Jewish aspiration. Hence the reverence for it.
It was wonderful hearing you go through that. I've gone through a lot of Bible lessons myself. It was wonderful hearing it from another perspective.
Yeah.
And the difficulty of monotheism I like the way you explained that.
Yeah. Yeah, monotheism is a very demanding kind of view of God, mostly because it anchors morality in a single original source. In polytheism, there's a God of war and a God of peace. There's a God of property and a God of thieves. There's a God of lust and a God of purity of family and so on. So polytheism offers a multiplicity of options which does not then of necessity lead to any kind of commitment to what we now would consider to be morality. That comes directly out of monotheism. And in that regard, monotheism is uncomfortable, because most of us would like to have excuses for whatever we want to do, and therefore to be kind of, shackled to only one option. This you may do, this you can't do, is not necessarily what most people like.
That's very well explained. I like
Yeah.
that. I'm getting to the end of my formal questions and all this, but as you look back on a life rich with many blessings, obviously a very wonderful woman here and many good children, and the good work that you've been able to do, is what gives you the most satisfaction in your life at this point?
Teaching has really always been not only the heart of the rabbinate, it is really the identification of the rabbinate. And being able to share with others and discover with others new insights, both in sacred texts, but also in the possible answers to the questions that life poses, continues to be, to me, an exciting and ever-stimulating and never-ending enterprise. The older I get, and I'm on my way to my 87th birthday, the richer it seems to me the options become. The more I see that there are so many things I, first of all, don't know, and others from which I can draw insights and bits of knowledge that can be applied and made use of, that I must say to you, to me, life is a continuous excitement and a so far an unalloyed joy to live, not saying that there aren't times and incidents and events that deeply grieve or challenge everything I sometimes am committed to do or to be. But over and over again, I know that I'm in a total stance of unremitting gratitude to the fact that the miracle that I am operates and lives within the miracle that the world is, and that therefore that mystery that somehow I sense behind it all and through it all, which we call God, is beckoning, asking for more, never satisfied that I've done what I maybe should do or could do. And so it just simply goes on, I hope, for as long as there is strength and life.
Much good luck to you.
Thank you.
This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Well, I thank you for coming and doing this.